I love that holding music, don't you? Well, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, I'm Zainab Badawi here in central London. Welcome to the third and final day of this virtual 2021 Ibrahim Governance Weekend. Now, so far we have heard from leaders across Africa and beyond the continent about the health, political and social impact of COVID-19. Well, today we turn our attention to Africa's economy, which of course has been hit hard by its first recession in 30 years. But at the same time, don't lose heart, because the crisis has created an opportunity to put in place a real strategy and model for economic growth at last. And now to guide today's discussion, I'm really glad to be joined today from Nairobi by Uche Okoronkwo. Now, many of you will be familiar with Uche, who leads reporting on business and economic affairs in Africa for China Global Television Network. So, Uche, the floor's yours.
Thank you so much, Zainab, for that great introduction. It's definitely a great pleasure to moderate today's panel, where, of course, we'll be assessing the most striking impacts of the pandemic on Africa's overall economy, and, of course, the relevancy of the solutions proposed, and even more importantly, what are indeed the prospects for new growth, as Zainab mentioned. I welcome you all to what we hope will be a spirited and insightful and encouraging discussion going forward. And let's start off just by highlighting the realities that exist on ground since this pandemic hit. Now, as the Mo Ibrahim report highlighted, we know the economic toll of the pandemic has been far worse than the health impacts here in Africa. As a result, data shows us Africa has entered recession for the first time in 3 decades. So we know it is a critical time to start taking stock of Africa's growth model going forward, the realities of its complex debt situation, its very limited fiscal landscape, and of course, the ability of African governments to mitigate these effects. As a financial journalist, the question that comes up every day as we talk with stakeholders is, are all these summits, all these multilateral meetings, all these generous commitments we see from the international community, are they enough to get Africa back onto a sustainable growth trajectory and suddenly to see a rebound in economic growth going forward? Now, as the report noted, Africa's response has been quite weak because, of course, the pandemic basically laid bare just how vulnerable Africa's growth model is, its excessive dependence on external demand and supply, insufficient local job creation, and of course, growing inequalities. At the same time, as Zainab says, crisis brings about opportunity and change. So keeping in mind the underlying climate change issues, as well as positive developments on the continent, such as Africa's digital revolution, and of course, the Africa projects such as the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, this could be an opportunity for Africa to reset itself going forward. So the crisis has revealed a lot. It also revealed an encouraging commitment to solving Africa's issues from Africa's leaders, key institutions, international community. And when I say key institutions, I mean AU, UNECA, the AFDB, and of course, Africa's private sector as well. So on that note, let me introduce the experts that will be taking on some of these issues with me on today's panel. We're joined by Rosa Whitaker. She's the president and CEO of the Whitaker Group. We're also joined by Sandra Kramer, director for Africa at the European Commission. And of course, the Mo Ibrahim New Generation from the Now Generation Forum, we're joined by Ma Suha. So great to have you all with us today. We have other participants who we hope will be joining us during the course of the panel. But first, we're fortunate to open today's discussion with a keynote speech from Dr. Donald Kaberuka. He, of course, has been a strong voice in Africa's economic revival. He's also the Africa Union's special envoy on COVID-19. So let's take a listen in to his keynote speech.
Good afternoon, friends, colleagues. Good afternoon, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be back at the Mo Ibrahim weekend. It's an incredible opportunity always for all of us to catch up and exchange on different issues. For this session, the issue before us is a question which is framed as, is this a key moment to reinvent Africa's growth model, given what has been going on with COVID? I think, as all of us realize, where we're now is that in many countries, there is a recession for the first time in 30 years. Even though the world was badly prepared, curious enough, Africa was actually better prepared. I know this will sound controversial for some, but Africa was indeed better prepared. You look at the Africa CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which has done an amazing job. The Africa Medical Platform, and many countries were able to put in place measures already which minimized the pandemic, the health impact of COVID. However, the economic cost has been very, very high. The next lesson I've learned is about the global supply chains. But it's been total surprise to many of us how nations have rushed to impose trade barriers, even the nations which are big champions of free trade, impose barriers on export of vaccines or other medical supplies. That lesson will be far-reaching in terms of how far we can trust the global supply chains in future emergencies. And the last lesson I've learned was the fickle nature of the international support during the pandemics has been very, very underwhelming. Underwhelming in the sense that it has taken months, a year even, to discuss about the nature of financial support to provide to needy countries who have suffered from this pandemic. When you look at the amount of resources available as stimulus packages in rich countries, which we are not able to do because we don't have those fiscal resources or monetary space to do so. The difference between us in many countries is that they can print money, they can pour fiscal bazookas out there. We can't. And so the risk of divergence is quite large, especially in the context of weakened multilateral systems and inability of the international architecture to provide the needed support for that, repairing the damage, returning our economies to growth. But which growth model will that be? Three key considerations. Number one, unless that model is inclusive, unless that model lifts all boats, not simply some boats, unless that model reinforces the safety nets, it cannot be sustained. So we'll have to rethink growth that is inclusive and transformational in a meaningful way. The second, well, to carefully look at what this unreliability of the global supply chains mean in the context of the Africa continental free trade area. A number of countries already think about manufacturing vaccines and other medical supplies. But obviously, it cannot be done in every country. However, the CFTA provides an opportunity for some of these centers of excellence on the continent where we can look at the global supply chains and what it means, not simply for vaccines, but for other supplies as well. The third thing is how we prepare for future pandemics. Because obviously this is not the last one. the link between health expenditures and the economic outcomes will have to be better carefully analyzed. In spite of all these things I said, I remain very optimistic. Africa's demographic momentum is unstoppable. It's a big trend. For a long time in years to come, there'll be more African doctors, more African engineers, more African farmers, more African economic actors than elsewhere in the world. It's a force which is unstoppable. And we have to figure out how already within the African continental free trade area, we provide opportunity for our young people to train, to equip themselves with the knowledge, which will ensure that in the future, we take advantage of opportunities and able to resist, to be more resilient to challenges which will inevitably be there. So I want to thank you. It's always a pleasure to be at the Foundation's event. Thank you.
I would like to thank Dr. Donald Kaberuka for that perceptive look at the realities around Africa and, of course, COVID-19 1 year on. And with those insights in mind, let's open the discussion now to our esteemed panelists. To kickstart today's discussion, I would like to ask each panelist, highlight briefly for us, what are the most striking shortfalls in Africa's economies that need primary and urgent attention, especially 1 year after the pandemic hit? And I'll just start with you, Sandra Kramer. Give us your insights.
Yes, hi, Uchi and panelists and audience. Thank you very, very much. I'm standing in for Director General Koen Doens today. He regrets not being here, and it's an honor for me to be here, and it's very good to see you again, Uchi. So I don't have to dwell on the economic crisis which was caused by the pandemic. I think that was discussed in previous panels, and we all know, and we've also heard from Dr. Kaberuka how important the hit on the economy has been. Now, just to underline that the EU has been on the side of Africa since the outbreak of the pandemic, with vaccine solidarity, with support to debt relief, and also with socioeconomic recovery. And the recovery is really priority number one, and it forms the basis of our future cooperation. I just want to recall that we immediately mobilized 8 billion in support for Africa's COVID-19 response, given a lot of direct budget support, which creates immediate fiscal space for governments to address the health crisis and the socioeconomic impact. And the EU is, of course, also the largest contributor to COVAX, and that is the EU budget and the member states together with 2.7 billion in funding, which have helped deliver 23 million doses to 44 countries in Africa. I agree it's not enough, and I agree more needs to be done because the needs are enormous. And really in this crisis, no one is safe until everyone is safe from this virus. So we are continuing, and President von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, in the recent Global Health Summit in Rome, announced a 1 billion funding Team Europe initiative to look at local vaccine and pharmaceutical manufacturing in Africa, because this was also just described by Donald Kaberuka, is one of the things that was the most striking, is that Africa is reliant. 99% of what they get back in as vaccines is imported and not produced within the continent. So that is one of the things that I would say to you, Uche, is a shortfall, which we are recognizing and are addressing. Now, just on the economic recovery, we just had a very important summit in Paris. The summit was held on the 18th of May. And there, the international community really translated, as you said before, we have all these summits and what do they do? Well, there was the allocation of special drawing rights. 33 billion, as you know, will go to African countries. There's, of course, the support to the debt service suspension initiative and the G20 framework of debt treatment beyond the DSSI. So all that is helping African governments with fiscal space. The EU has also contributed to the IMF Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust 183 million will help 23 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But in the longer term perspective, I think the recovery should be economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable, as Donald Kaberuka just said. And the idea behind the Paris Summit was to commit all that fiscal space and the newly allocated special drawing rights to the Sustainable Development Goals. I just want to give one example, which I think that comes out of Paris, where I think the international community commitments and the local ownership is really coming together as a success formula. And that's actually Sudan. Its IMF debt arrears are almost cleared, and it's close to reaching the heavily indebted poor country's decision point. And that makes it a historical democratic transition even more sustainable. So what do we do to address the shortfalls that we have seen? Well, as you know, we are moving forward to an EU-AU summit, hopefully early next year, where we will put forward an investment package which focuses on that socioeconomic recovery, on creating sufficient jobs for the youth population, and really focusing on future-oriented policies, looking to green and digital transitions, decent jobs, and also the relevant education and skills agenda. And most importantly, to attract sustainable investments involving the private sector. So I think that is where our focus is at the moment, Uchi, and I'm very happy to continue further on into the discussion to give you examples of particular opportunities which we see in green transition, in particular renewable energy, and in the digital transformation.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Definitely we'll get into that as we go through the panel, but I just want to direct to Rosa Whitaker. We know US-Africa relations, they've been governed mostly by the AGOA, Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. So as we discuss what are the issues and shortfalls that you see in Africa's economies that need primary and urgent attention? Can you tie it into the efforts to reimagine what is possible for US-Africa trade going forward? It looks like we don't have your audio right now, Rosa.
So in the okay, now can you hear me?
Great.
Ochi, I want to thank you, and just to thank the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. It's a pleasure to be on such a distinguished panel. I mean, the one thing that this pandemic has taught us, it illustrates how profoundly dependent Africa is on the choices, the blunders, the actions, and even sometimes the self-interest of others. So as we look for post-COVID or even in this COVID climate recovery, I think we should look to dismantle Africa's dependency on specifically Western countries, because we've seen what happens. I mean, one thing we can start with is vaccine dependency. When we look at the vaccine dependency, where we have Africa with 18% of the global population, 2% of the administered vaccine. COVAX has committed to 20% of its member countries, and I understand have done about 15 million. There is no reason why the Western countries could not have gone into partnerships with some of the African manufacturers so that Africa could manufacture its own vaccinations instead of this kind of dependency, paternalistic approach. Now, the pharmaceutical companies in the West will give you the familiar argument, we've invested all of this money in research and development, we have to recover our costs. But that's not true in this case, because I know in the US, we have subsidized those pharmaceutical companies that are producing the vaccines in the billions of dollars. The European community has subsidized. So then one could argue that this should be a public good, and we don't need to go into why there's an obligation to Africa. So I believe there should be a more interdependent relationship through trade, but we have to break this dependency. We have seen what dependency can do, and we have a lot of incentives for this kind of partnerships to end this vaccine dependency. Right now, the market for the vaccines in Africa is about $1.3 billion, projected to grow to over $2 billion by 2030. I mean, all across the continent, African leaders are asking the question, why do our vaccinations have to come from India? India is in such dire straits. Why are you producing AstraZeneca vaccinations in India for Africa? So the specific recommendation, I think a smart form of contribution would be to support the Africa Union and Afra-Exim Bank initiative on the vaccination trust, where they are procuring vaccines and manufacturing. On the broader issues, we really do have to look at Africa's entire kind of relationship with Western countries to make that less dependent. And that's why I have proposed, as you mentioned, to the Biden administration, and I think it could be globalized, a totally new approach. Africa, as far as this post-economic recovery, is going to need a lot of financing, external financing. We need more financing for infrastructure that shouldn't be ceded to China alone. So I propose, why don't we leverage the $46 trillion US bond market to provide guarantees for bonds for African financing. And Afra-Exim Bank is perfectly capable of issuing these bonds that could be globalized to China and the European Union. That's a form of unlocked capital that could be released for critical development. I have also said that we really need to look at this aid model. I am not a fan of Europe's aid model. I'm not a fan of America's aid model. It is insulting. It comes with so many conditionalities. You have to hear the donors then talk about donor fatigue in the US, just in terms of the bilateral aid model, not what we give to international organizations. It's been about $90 billion in 10 years, and nobody in Africa and America has been able to explain, where is this money going? Is it hitting Africa? So I respect the European Union when they, give out these figures, and American government officials when they give out these figures. But I've been at the table, and I believe, and I would love to be proven wrong, that in Europe and in America, a lot of that aid money is around the European and American capitals, is around Washington, D.C., and this bloated industrial aid complex of NGOs, of consulting firms that are taking this money and doing quote unquote education for farmers when Africa needs irrigation. And so I think that part of the problem is not just on the Western side. There's not been a united, concerted African model for informing the West, for working with the West in leading how it wants to be dealt with. I mean, I talk to African leaders all the time, and they say, well, is the Western taxpayers, is their policy, is their money, they should decide. And I would say, no, they shouldn't decide. And I'm also calling Africa should be at the table, determining how it wants to be dealt with by the West, because this COVID recovery model can be done in a vacuum. And I'm also asking for bold tax incentives to incentivize the private sector, which could also be globalized. Why can't we have tax credits, or in a case of America, repatriation of profits without taxes for investments made in Africa that are transformative? There's no reason that would cost anybody anything. I hear now the central bank, in America is talking about a global minimum corporate tax. Africa should be speaking out on that. Why should it have a minimum tax for corporations with such an asymmetrical economic situation? Africa should rather be looking to incentivize investment. So these are some of the things that I would suggest. Let's dismantle that Western aid model. Let's deal with vaccine dependency, and then use that to usher in a new model of dismantling this antiquated model that Africa has with the Western countries of dependency. And those are some of the specific things. Of course, some of the other things we know. We have to focus on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and that area. We have to look at, focus on urbanization, industrialization, corruption, digital transformation. That is fine. But I really believe that Africa has to lead this process, and Western countries have a moral, economic, and historical obligation to support.
Well, thank you, Rosa, for those great insights. We'll definitely be delving further into some of those issues raised by both you and Sandra. But first, I would like to get the local context. And on that note, I'd like to bring in our now Generation Forum representative, Masuka. She is part of the Foundation's youth network. But quickly, before we hear from her, let's take a look at some of the perspectives on Africa's future from the youth that we've heard at this year's forum so far.
Build robust preventative economic measures by making sure that we are not replicating Western models, but that we create our own African-centered models that are based on the experience of Africans. Also, we wanted to stress the point on diversification of economies and not just focusing on former natural resources, for example. The second point was to improve food security by capitalizing on producing our own goods and improving value chain. Also, by doing that, we were thinking that we should work a lot on the African free trade area by focusing not only on moving the goods, but also moving of the people, because it's just as important that every African feels at home, even when they go beyond their borders. And finally, the third point was the importance of having indeed some industries focused on manufacture, but also to adopt a proactive posture by focusing on education so that we can also develop knowledge-based economies.
We shouldn't really feel pressured to conform to the Washington consensus or the Beijing consensus. We should really very much try to work together to find our own.
Certainly a lot of focus there on us finding our own solutions, Africa finding its own solutions to Africa's problems. So Masuka, I'd like to bring you into the discussion as we look at the most striking shortfalls in Africa's economies that you feel are more urgent right now. And I'd just like to mention that pre-COVID-19, the quality of life for youth in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, it had been steadily improving in terms of literacy, unemployment rates. I don't know whether you would agree with me on that. Now, the fear is that with the pandemic, we may now have what they're calling a lockdown generation, where poverty rates, unemployment rates have become the trend. So tapping from your experience, Masuka, what are the priorities for the youth of Africa? What are the key action points you would love to see addressed? What are the most urgent issues?
Thank you very much, Ushe, and good day to everyone. Allow me first to thank really the Foundation for allowing the youth to have a seat at this important table and also participating in this conversation, because as you know, the youth is our present. Most of the people who are under 25 are 62% of Africa's population is under 25. But also we need to also remember that most of them are actually less than 15. So really, we are the present now, but we are also the future. We'll be making the workforce of the future. And I very much like what Dr. Kaberuka said. We are the future. We are the ones who will be the business leaders, the political leaders, the workers, the consumers, the savers, and the investors. So it's critical for us to rethink our current model. And we don't really need to dwell again into the entire impact of the pandemic. I think it was very well explained by Mrs. Kramer and Mrs. Whitaker. I think we all agree that in any case, we know that the old model of staying at the bottom of the value chains and supplying raw materials and oil and all our natural resources and competing between ourselves, African countries, in order to supply those and being at the receiving end of manufactured product is not something that we want. It is not serving us well. So one of the key priorities that really emerged from the Now Generation Forum, coming from even activists, scholars, people who are not necessarily private sector development specialists and all that, they all said, we really want Africa to industrialize. And we know that this is something that it is in the agenda of the AU and everything, but we have not really seen it up to now in actually mainstreamed into the policies of these countries. I mean, we have Ghana, Morocco, Kenya, Ethiopia giving a focus on that. And I think more countries are coming into actually putting industrialization at the core and at the center of what they do. And when we say industrialization, yes, we need to have some level of sovereignty, of security, already securing our basic needs, whether it is in terms of security, whether it is in terms of feeding ourselves, clothing ourselves. So that is already the basics. Now, we also are mindful of the trends that are coming, the 4IR that is already here. And we don't want Africa to miss out on it. I mean, as we said, the working age population that we will have in Africa, we won't have it elsewhere in the world. Other continents are aging while we are growing younger, but becoming more active. So we really want to harness the power of 4IR, and that will need actual major investments into infrastructure. So that is already key. I think we all know the importance of the AFCFTA, and other youths have already explained what we need in this sense. The second priority really would be around tying on this entire agenda into sustainability and taking into account climate change. And in that regard, what we have seen is that for a long time, we've been focusing on measuring our progress through our GDP performance. We are growing by 7%, we're growing by 3%, etc. That is very fine, but at the same time, we have to remember that GDP is income. It's a flow concept, but what are we actually doing to our wealth? What are we doing to our natural resources? Are we squandering, our fish stocks, our mining, our oil, just to generate those short-term returns, while sometimes the companies that are exploiting those are not necessarily African empowered, let's say. So yes, our gross domestic product is rising, but is it really improving the wealth of Africans? Maybe not per se. So maybe we need to get more into the discussion, the issue of measuring wealth, talking about wealth. And we know that there are some MDBs that have some measures of how to capture, human capital and natural resource into the wealth measurements. So maybe there is an opportunity to take more the wealth dimension into account when we are measuring progress. The third priority would really be on partnerships already within ourselves as Africans. Yes, I think Mrs. Whitaker already talked about the dependencies we still have with other economies. And really, when you think about it, in Africa, we'll be having half of the population growth that will be happening from now on up to 2050 will be happening in Africa. So already in terms of demographics, we are a superpower. So we should be able to see our human capital as an asset and transform that as transitioning from being a demographic superpower to an actual economic and political and cultural superpower. And for that, we have to take into account the private sector in this. It has to play a role in this whole industrialization theme and renaissance. The governments also have a role, the leaders have a role into actually putting in place even the incentives or facilitating financial sector development, taking into account all the reforms that they have to make in order to facilitate this. The informal sector should not be forgotten. The rural sector also should not be forgotten. There's 60% of our population. So really, it's not something that, you know, one public sector can do or private sector can do, or even youth can do alone. So the partnerships is very important, even at the continental level. Now we need also to partner, yes, externally. But what we see is that when we are partnering externally, the external partners are very prepared. I mean, just go to Google, try to search. Sorry, Sandra, I'll be using the EU example. There are so many papers, so many papers on you know, this new EU-Africa partnership, and it is all coming from, you know, European think tanks per se. We are seeing some from Africa, but we need more. So maybe we would need to have more partnerships with the research sector, you know, the private sector, the think tanks, having African-led agendas on the issues that matter to us. So really, those were the few points we wanted to make. Another point on financing would be that, yes, mobilizing external finance is good, but we also need at some point to make much more efforts into mobilizing our own domestic resources. And sorry if I use domestic, I still mean Africa, our internal resources, being able to mobilize our savings, being able to put into place the reforms that, you know, will curtail the illicit financial flows that are bleeding out of Africa, etc. So these were basically the few points we had from the Now Generation Forum. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Masura, for that very spirited comment there. And I'd just like to continue on that note. As you said, financing is quite key for Africa. In fact, in order to recover from the pandemic, Africa needs to close a financing gap of around 400 or over $400 billion in the next 3 years. Now, I'd like to go to you, Sandra. You talked about a little bit about this earlier. We've seen international initiatives such as, of course, the DSSSI. It has helped, but the question is it enough going forward? The international community has made some encouraging commitments. We talked about the Paris Summit. We saw discussions around the New Deal for Africa. And it did address a commitment by other nations to mobilize some of their special drawing rights allocations for Africa. It also talked about large-scale investments in health, education, and of course, the fight against climate change. In this context, can you give us some more insight into how you see the EU-Africa partnership evolving and supporting Africa's recovery?
Yes, Uchi, thanks very much. And thanks also to Rosa and Masuka. I think very wise words overall. And let me just get back, if I may, a little bit to what Rosa said, because I actually completely agree. The old-fashioned models, the sort of donor-recipient thinking is very much, you know, behind everyone. I don't think anybody's on that line. And I think we completely agree that what we're talking about, Uchi, here are equal partnerships with responsibilities on both sides of the equation. And I think that's a really important notion. In terms of what we do, quite a lot of the support that Rosa was mentioning to us goes into treasuries. This is straight budget support. So there again, we empower national and local authorities to take responsibility and to make reforms possible in their countries. And in terms of the model, Rosa, you were mentioning that they are the donors, so they decide. That's not how we see a partnership. We decide together in partnerships. We see partnerships really as something that is to do with our policy priorities and interests, but obviously also with the interests and the policy priorities of our African partners. And for us, the model is very simple, actually. It's about de-risking investments into Africa. We will, with our budget, de-risk investments. We will, of course, work to improve the investment and the business climate. That's very important. And we will focus on education and skills so that investors find a workforce that has the skills for tomorrow. And of course, lastly, a focus on the CFTA. That is the regional and continental free trade, which is very important. And that is your jewel, and that could be the engine to recovery and sustainable growth in the Africa continent. I think that's very important. Now, what Masuka just said is absolutely crucial. And I think those are very wise words. And by the way, Commissioner Jutta Urpilainen, who is the Commissioner for International Partnerships, her portfolio name was changed by President von der Leyen into International Partnerships. She has just established a youth special representative and a youth advisor. What she will do in her mandate over the next years will focus on youth and on education. Those are the two political priorities of her mandate. Now, very important what you said about sustainability and climate change. And I just want to say that if there's anything that distinguishes what the European Union wants to partnership with in Africa is sustainability, be it environmental, social, financial, economical. Sustainability really is, I think, a unique selling point. We will not do things if they're environmentally harmful. There must be climate benefits or do no harm, but we will not invest, for example, in fossil fuel. And the point was very well heard, Masuka. I think that it should be absolutely clear that in the partnerships that we are seeking, there is no place for fossil fuel-based industry. We will not. I am very sure that there are going to be economies that will depend on that, and that is fine. But we in our investments will not focus on that. What we will do is very much what was said on private sector, on governments who need to reform. And in that sense, I was glad to hear the focus on domestic resource mobilization, on illicit financial flows, as well as the fight against corruption and tax evasion. So that, I think, Uchi, is very important to mention, is the partnership. There are so many papers, and there are so many things that we can do. And obviously, the problems and the issues that we're facing are huge. And I think it's just actually a good sign that there are so many things going around. But I think we all need to go into the same direction, that sustainable, green, just, and digital recovery. And that is what was agreed at the Paris summit. And that, I think, is a very important way forward. So with that, Uchi, that's how I see partnerships, really as true equal partnerships with responsibilities and interests at both sides of the equation. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that, Sandra. And with that, I'll just ask you, Rosa, you seem very passionate about Africa finding solutions or playing a key role in finding a solution to its own problem. And Sandra just brought up the issue of taxation, illicit tax evasion as well. And we do know that it is striking in Africa how we're still at the bottom of global averages when it comes to domestic resource mobilization and such issues. So give us a sense of how you feel the continent can bridge that gap with other regions around the world and put in place a much needed taxation system.
Sorry. I think that what we know about proper taxation is that there has to be a less reliance on human discretion. So in order to increase the appropriate level of taxes, it's going to take some investments in technology. And I think there are a lot of appropriate technologies that are suitable for Africa. And even if you look at these kind of technologies that are appropriate, to me, that's an example of smart aid, of smart kind of assistance. I think that there are other kinds of aid that's not that smart in my view, but that's a good investment. I also believe that for the illicit financial flows, that is where, and I agree with Sandra, of course, of where capacity development, skills development, we need to look at how we build the capacity of the tax authorities across Africa, But we also should have some punitive measures and some accountability for Western investors who create these very complicated tax schemes, royalty schemes, to make sure that they do not show a profit in Africa in order to move whatever profit or as much revenue as possible back to the capital. So that is, I believe that you're exactly right. The goal should be an increase in tax collection without having an onerous burden on vulnerable populations. If African countries even got better at collecting the taxes that are currently in place, that would be major. I also believe that you can bolster the taxes with the industrialization growth and also with intra-African expanded trade.
So I'd like to shift the conversation now a little bit. And Masukaba, we know Africa has responded to this crisis through innovation, and that has been largely driven by the youth in Africa. So give me a sense of how you think we can rethink the continent's economic and governance systems in order to sort of push our digital innovation going forward. What are the critical areas that you would like to see open up in order for, especially for the youth, to better contribute to their innovative ideas to the continent's post-pandemic recovery?
Thank you, Uche. Really, if I would maybe say one word to sum it all up, it would be that the actual challenges that Africa is facing are all business opportunities for the youth. And they're all trying to solve each challenge one at a time by providing some type of solution through their startup. But the problem is that they are facing major constraints. Sometimes they may be related to the business environment. Sometimes they may be related to the fact that they are youth and that their businesses cannot really always compete with some imports that are coming in, or compete with the tendency of some governments to always trust solutions that have been manufactured elsewhere. So maybe one solution that can be better adopted by governments would be to actually move more into affirmative procurement. Whenever they need something, they must. And there are some countries that have put that in place. I know Botswana did that, Kenya did that, but it's something that should be more mainstreamed. Whenever a government has any service or any needs, the first thinking would be, how do I use our own resources to bolster our own private sector? And in that private sector, you do have the young entrepreneurs, and you have maybe older ones, but in any case, it is money that you're spending that is responding to your need, and that is also creating the jobs that you've been looking for so long. So that is already one, affirmative procurement. That has to be done maybe more systematically. The other questions are just improving the business environment and making sure that fair competition is happening. If I look at some of the value chains, especially in agriculture, for example, you still, in many markets, you always have some incumbents that are there, maybe because they're benefiting from some type of quota that allows them to be able to be in the business while always squeezing out the youth who may not have the social capital, but also who may not have the means basically to do whatever it takes to get some quotas. So improving that is also key. The last one is around the financing, and we've seen some governments put some actual measures to boost financing for youth. I'm thinking about, for example, I see that in Senegal, I see that in Botswana, I see that in many other countries, and we need to support those types of measures.
Well, tying into digital innovation, we also have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And I'd just like to get all of your perspectives on this project. There's been much noise about it. And we know, of course, there's been significant political commitment to the project, to the agreement, but they're still hammering out a lot of the details. So realistically, how do you all think, how soon do you think before Africa can we reap the benefits from this trade agreement? What are your insights, individual thoughts on that? And I'll start with you, Sandra.
Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me now. I was muted. Obviously, this is momentous, and I said it before, and we have, as European Union, obviously already supported the CFTA, the negotiations, but also through the International Trade Center and other means on getting as far as we are now. But I think what is very important is that, Uche, as you said it before, this is an African ownership. This is carried by the heads of state and government in Africa. This is leaders who are fully behind this. And that is what I think is important to make it a success. It is not going to depend on others. I of course, know that the European Union and other international players and partnerships will be there, will be alongside, to address any and every corner of this problem, of this free trade area, to look at customs, to look at tariffs, to look at making sure that trade flows freely and fairly across the continent. But the good thing about the CFTA really is that this is carried by the African leaders in the African continent. And we are very happy with the setting up, of course, of the CFTA Secretariat in Accra, in Ghana. And of course, with the support of the African Union Commissioner Muchanga, who has played a key role in getting as far as we are now. And where we are going now in the European Union is that we're planning our next budgetary cycle and our next partnerships. And the CFTA will play a very, very important role in that. So there is, I don't think anything that, can describe how important it is. We feel that this is actually the new and very resilient growth model for the African continent, and that is driven by Africa. It must also be driven by country-focused reforms, and it will boost productivity, it will spur growth, and we will be alongside it. Thanks.
Rosa, I mean, you played a huge role in the setting up of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. So you're very familiar with trade around Africa. As we reimagine how we engage with the international community, what are your thoughts on how we are progressing in terms of engaging with each other as it pertains to trade going forward?
Well, thank you, Uche. I just think that's one of the greatest opportunities before Africa right now, and that's expanding intra-Africa trade. I am a huge supporter of the African Continental Free Trade Area and Agreement. And I believe you have to, in trade, first start building on what's working. So I think when you look at the digital economy and the African Continental Free Trade Secretariat, they're making, I think, impressive progress on the e-commerce protocol that will harmonize African countries and integrate African countries around e-commerce, because that is where Africa is leading. When we even look at mobile transactions, for example, Africa occupies 64% of all of the world's mobile transactions, with a value of over $450 billion. Now that's significant. So that's where I would start. I would build on what's working, and that is working. And you harmonize that across Africa, I think that would be major. And when we look at, we're now looking in America at how we approach the Goa initiative. And central to that has to be this regional integration. And it's going to be almost impossible to integrate Africa without dealing with the paucity of physical infrastructure. Africa is the most balkanized region of the world. We know that. It's a relic of colonialism that still has not been addressed, and it must be addressed. It's going to be impossible to rewrite those geographical boundaries, but you can integrate. And we can incentivize the private sector, and we can use the capital markets and every instrument at our disposal to make sure that Africa is landing.
And Masuka, I'd love to get your take on the youth's perspective on that project. Do you feel like you are included? And how do you think that the youth will play or can play a major role in pushing that trade agreement forward?
I believe from the youth perspective, we are very happy and proud, and we fully support the project that our leaders have been spearheading for quite some time. And as was said by one of the NGF representatives, we really want, as we are facilitating the movement of goods, to also facilitate the movement of people. That will also facilitate the movement of ideas. So goods, yes, they need to move. The financing, the payments need to move, and the people also need to move. So that is really key. Another point would be, as we are facilitating, making all these reforms to create one single market, we should also have one particular focus on supporting the African champions and the entire sets of SMEs that they are dragging along, so that this agreement works for us, for African-powered businesses, and basically businesses that are owned by Africans.
Well, we're certainly running out of time, but I just have to throw in green finance as we move forward, because green finance is also tied to a sustainable recovery going forward. And I'd like to get your take, Sandra, on how the European Commission will certainly help in financing Africa's green finance projects as we move forward.
Yes, this is extremely important, and the discussion is great, and thanks very much for that. And I think we all agree that a continent which has, looking at your demographic growth, cannot be resilient on solely commodities, exports, remittances, or FDIs. This is what Masuko and Rosa already said, and it's very important. So the finance that will come in will be, and that is what I referred to earlier in the Paris summit, agreed to link it to the Sustainable Development Goals. So the fiscal space and the additional investment and the additional financial resources coming in are linked to greener and more sustainable growth. And that is very clear. And I think one of the things that I wanted to still mention, and that goes back to what Masuka just said, is all these business opportunities for the youth, for young people. And one of the things that she highlighted as well is the financing, the access to finance, the startup, the seed capital, the pre-seed capital, which is often missing, often also because there is really perhaps indeed the incumbents and not so much trust maybe in the youth actually being able to do that. Therefore, the business environment and the investment environment and the financing go hand in hand. And President von der Leyen, during the Paris meeting, announced a Team Europe initiative called Investing in Young Businesses in Africa. And this is to set up financial support, but also technical support for small companies in Africa in various stages of their development, from the very beginning to the first 2-3 years of the company. And that money will focus on digital and on green and on inclusive enterprises. And I must say, obviously, also on youth and women, because those are top priorities for what we do. But that is typically an example, Uchi, of how our financing is going to be green and is going to be focusing on young businesses in Africa. So that is for me very important. And if I may just add that I think our strategies can actually only be efficient if it is also implemented at country level. Vision and leadership is needed on all sides, and at country level, reforms are really necessary to adapt to market developments and to seize all these new opportunities, because that will only truly help Africa build back better, greener and stronger. Thanks.
Right, you're so right.
So,
You're so right, Sandra.
Uche, it's Zainab here. Uche, it's Zainab Badawi here in central London. I have to join this wonderful lineup of women here, gate crashing your economic discussion, because no economic discussion about Africa is complete without Vera Songwe, the Executive Director of UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, who joins us. Vera, terrific to see you as always. So Vera, I know you've been listening in a little bit to this conversation. So the impact of COVID-19 on Africa, recovery, of course, is the key word. Response is important. We've been discussing that at earlier forums. So just give us your overview, and then I'm going to hand back to Uche to carry on with this conversation. I think we have another 20 odd minutes or so. So Vera, over to you. If you could unmute. We're not very good at lip reading here, you see. Thank you.
Actually, I'm not on mute. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you loud and clear, my dear, yes.
Oh, okay. Good, good. No, I was saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. It's always a pleasure to join the Mo Ibrahim Governance Weekend. I'm happy to be with everybody. I must apologize. I had a little bit of a delayed flight from the north of Ethiopia. So I came in and I asked to just listen in for a while to catch the stream. Rosa, Ma, Uche, everybody, Sandra, good to see you. The impact of COVID-19 on Africa is a big question. I think three things. I'll start with some of the positives. My sense is what it has been able to do is it has been able to bring, I think, Africa together. When COVID-19 hit in March of 2020, one of the things we saw was African ministers, African finance ministers coming together immediately, beginning to say, you know, how do we address this problem? What do we do as a collective? President Cyril Ramaphosa creating the special envoys group with Ngozi and Donald and Tijan and everybody else that was in that group, you know, again, to take the Africa message as one united message. The Economic Commission for Africa, Afri-Exim Bank, Strive, we put up this African Medical Supplies platform, which I think while the rest of the world was struggling to get PPEs, at the time we were talking about PPEs, Africa was able to seamlessly purchase and procure PPEs because there was a pool procurement, there was UNISM that came together. Now I think President Cyril Ramaphosa put together the African Vaccines Acquisition Task Team, and this is this next story, is we need vaccines. When you look at it, what we now have on the continent is 2.1 for every 100 people has been vaccinated in Africa, whereas in the advanced world, it's 28 for every 100 people. And of course, in places like the United States, we're reaching herd immunity at 60%. The UK is slowly following behind that number. We would like to get there as well. And we welcome the announcement by the United States, Rosa, yesterday or 2 days ago now, the days go by so fast, of, you know, providing another 5 million doses of vaccines to the continent, but that's a drop in the bucket. We need to vaccinate at least 700 million people on the continent to get to herd immunity. So it's an important part of the question. What COVID has also done is it has, of course, stretched our health facilities, but we knew that before. We knew that our health facilities were going to be stretched either way. And so we are continuing to try to stand them up. But that has also resulted, I think, in a strengthening of the private sector provision. You have a lot more companies that are producing masks and sanitizers and the whole sort of PPE matter around COVID. Our economy has suffered the most. I think when COVID started, everybody was worried about the health crisis because that's what it was a health pandemic. But for Africa, it's cost the continent almost 5.4% of GDP. The IMF will tell you that it is the first recession the continent has had in 25 years. We are looking at maybe 100 million more people falling into poverty. We are looking at unemployment that is going to double, if not triple. Before the crisis, we needed to create 13 million jobs every year for the continent, for the youth who were coming out of schools and getting into the age of maturity and working age. Now we need maybe 16 million jobs. So really, it's going to be a very difficult process. The good news is, as has been said before, you know, we had just launched January 1, 2020, the 2021, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. So we do have a blueprint. for how we get out of this crisis. We do have a blueprint that says if we're able to begin to put in place the PIDA, the infrastructure development agenda for the continent. Let's remember, as we talk about, and the Economic Commission for Africa with Oxford University has just done some studies on how one sustainably grows out of the crisis. And we grow out of the crisis by growing out sustainably, by ensuring that, first of all, we do the investments in a green recovery that are needed. But we also need to ensure that as we talk about growing out of the crisis in a green and sustainable manner, we give ourselves time to transition. And I think it's very important that as we talk about that transition process, we talk about the need to use transition fuel like gas to make sure that we can cross that bridge and give ourselves at least 25 to 30 years to get there. This is an important part for countries like Nigeria, for countries like Senegal, Mauritania, Mozambique, of course, Kenya, that are now using this as a transition fuel. And when we talk about gas as a transition fuel, we are also talking about the fact that the alternative to gas is coal, the alternative to gas is heavy fuel oil, which is 4 times the cost. So I think that for a continent that is trying to get out of a crisis, anything we can get and anything we can do becomes an imperative and important. So I think when we look at that, then of course, what has sort of come out of this crisis is the use of digital technology. We're seeing 3 times more use of digital technology than we did before. But again, the inequalities in the use of digital technology are rearing their face. And so, you know, if you're a young girl in one of the African metropolitan areas, if you're in Accra, if you're in Abidjan, you can probably access the internet and continue your courses. If you're not, then of course you don't have access to the internet. And so what it is causing from a very human point of view is a lot of young girls in the rural areas who used to be an asset because they were going to school, they were getting access to school feeding programs and not a burden to their families, have become a burden and a commodity. So they're being put up for early childhood marriages and others. And so I think we do need to, so there's the macroeconomy, which we talk about, the debt and the fact that debt has gone up. But I think there is also a human perspective. There's this young girls who are out of school, and we need to find some way very quickly to spread probably access to digital technology to make that happen. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Vera, thank you so much for that. We're so glad to have you join our panel. Now, of course, we're running out of time. There's so many itching questions I have for you, Dr. Vera. One that specifically has to do with Africa's debt going forward. But before I ask you the question, I just want to add our front row. As we are trying to keep up with time, I want to add our front row members to the discussion as well. And I'd like to invite Mary Robinson. She's from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation board. I'd like to invite her into the discussion as well. So Dr. Vera, very quickly, we know debt is a huge issue when we talk about how Africa is going to finance its way out of this. We know UNECA also published quite a comprehensive report on how we can build back better going forward. So when we talk about the debt issue, is it exaggerated? Give us your insights on how we can manage that going forward.
Well, you know, the issue of debt is really about your ability to pay back your borrowing. And one of the things that the Economic Commission for Africa has been doing is talking about, you know, leveling the playing field in terms of borrowing costs. So today, Africa borrows about $150 billion of Eurobonds. So 40% of Africa's borrowing is Eurobonds, 60% of the cost of Africa's borrowing is Eurobonds. So as you can see, Eurobond borrowing is very expensive. And at a time when we have a crisis like there's a transfer of resources from the developing world into the developed world, may ask, you know, wonder why are we doing that? Yes, of course, there is the macroeconomic. When we talk about cost of borrowing, we talk about sort of 2 components. One is a sort of what we call the default risk, the cost of, you know, macroeconomic stability in the country. And then on top of that is what we call the liquidity premium, which is if I buy your paper, can I, you know, make it into more liquid assets and do something different with it? And the private sector likes to have as much liquid assets as they can have. And so we are asking, for example, because we have just gotten an issuances of special drawing rights, that we use some of those special drawing rights to create equivalent institutions on the continent as we have in Europe and the United States called repo markets that will allow for the private sector to be able to turn those bonds into more liquid assets so that they don't charge that extra premium on Africa's borrowing. That is part of Africa's debt, is extra premium, and we can take that away in a way that is, I think, levels the playing field for Africa's borrowing. Of course, there are some countries that are going to get into a debt crisis. And I look at a country like Cape Verde, where essentially Cape Verde was a low middle income country, graduated, and we congratulate them for graduating and becoming a full middle income country. But that also meant that they have less access to concessional resources, which means cheap and affordable World Bank and other concessional resources. But then they do that, and then 1 year later, you have the COVID crisis, and Cape Verde is a tourist economy, which means that 80% of the economy gets shut down. A lot of the support that has been given to Africa has been given to low-income countries. 75% of African economies are now low and middle-income economies. The world has to shift its mind away from thinking Africa is just low income. So there's been a lot of help to 25% low income and not a lot of help to 75% middle income countries where we have a large proportion of our populations and where actually the risk of people falling into poverty is much higher. And so one of the things we're talking about is how can we ensure that assistance to the continent, it's not stuck in 1960 and 1980 low income countries. It has to be to vulnerable countries that have been particularly affected by this crisis. And I think that again begins to look at the debt situation in a different way. We're very grateful that the G20 decided to put together the debt service suspension initiative proposed by the African finance ministers. We think that that has run its course. We believe that an on-lending of the special drawing rights that allows to create something like a poverty reduction and growth facility, $100 billion in the IMF, will really be able to provide some additional resources, but also a middle income facility. Countries like Morocco, countries like Kenya, that are tourism economies, are essentially now paying, but they are not necessarily the ones that immediately get the help at times of crisis. So my sense is, if we do not support Africa now, we will have a huge debt crisis into the future. But we must say that Africa has been quite resilient. We are now 18 months into this crisis, and we've spoken a lot about a debt crisis on the continent. But what we have seen is huge resilience. Governments have made choices. They have unfortunately cut away social protection programs to pay debt service interest because they want to keep access to the markets. They have decided to cut down on school rations because they want to keep access to the markets. We are forcing economies to make choices that they don't need to make because there are resources out there that could respond to both of these questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vera, for that very insightful response. Now, as the tradition is at the Ibrahim Forum, we don't just talk about challenges or commitments. We also talk about inclusive views on key action points going forward. And on that note, I'd like to bring in our front row, Mary Robinson. And the key question here is, how can Africa build back better, stronger? I'd like to get her insights on the priority areas for her.
So Uche, is Zainab Badawi again here in London. Unfortunately, President Mary Robinson is experiencing some connectivity problems and cannot be with us. However, we are delighted that we have Hamady Diop from the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, who I'm sure can pick up that point that you made. And so Hamady Diop, you heard what Uche said there. And of course, the new Partnership for Africa's Development is an initiative that has been around for a very long time. And we're now hearing about new blueprints for Africa and new economic models and strategies and so on. So are you content with what's been discussed, or do you feel that the blueprints are already known and what we really need is just some momentum for implementation?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for allowing me to join in on behalf of Dr. Mayaki and also extend his apologies. He was ready to join in, but at the last minute, I'm joining in actually from Conakry in Guinea. He received a call from the president, President Alpha Conde. He has to rush to see the president, and he has asked me to sit in and listen and also contribute as much as possible. So I would like to apologize for that. So I think Dr. Song has made some very good points, and I think most of them, as also an African Union institution, we own them. Of debt liquidity and also the blueprints that are available. But Dr. Mayaki has indicated also that I share with you maybe 5 kind of critical transformation that he believes are proponent to building back better and stronger on the African we want. The first one, he indicated that we need really transformational governments that are more democratic and more accountable. The second area also he thinks that we need to focus on in terms of rebuilding is also a transformational economic policies. So that maybe some of the policies need to be retweaked and to respond to the new basically challenges. The third one shared with me is the transformation of donor relationship and the debt crisis management, which Dr. Song has basically commented on extensively, so I will not get back to it. Then he talked also about the emerging technologies, how we use the innovation and the emerging technology also to leapfrog in terms of moving forward and building better. The last areas also he thinks that some time is left out is the issue of transformational youth, the policymakers, the activists, and the business leaders that need to be brought into this whole conversation. So let me stop at this stage. I know you have a challenging time, but if you want to make I'll be glad to come back. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Well, let's go to our audience questions now because we are running out of time. And one of the key questions from the audience is, of course, how can Africa build back better and stronger, as we were discussing before. So I'd just like, before we close the panel, for each of our panelists to give us just a full response and a brief response on what are the most striking issues they think or striking areas they think will help to push forward Africa's economy as we build better, stronger. We've addressed some of them here, but give us your priorities.
Uchi, do you want me to start?
So, thank you, Sandra. Please do start.
Because I think there are two areas that I particularly want to highlight very briefly because we're running out of time. And I mentioned them before. One is we believe the green transition and the energy access. Really, there is abundant renewable energy sources, and that can be the engine for Africa's economic and social transformation. And I think locally available, sustainable, and stimulate local growth through the increased use of renewable energy is really important, also because the ever-growing demand in cities, for example. The second is the digital transformation, really bridging the digital divide and fostering that development and that growth of an inclusive, a sustainable, and also a responsible digital economy. So this is about investments, but it's also about the regulatory framework and the legal framework. And it's extremely important if we believe, and I think we do, that data is the resource of the 21st century. So this is an area where we have to be both bold and brave, but also careful. So there are many sides to that. There's the digital world and there's the dark side. But there's huge opportunities, and you've seen it in online shopping and banking and entertainment. And I think those are the two areas that, if you ask me, where do you want to focus on? That's where we want to focus on. The two main broader aspect really is that global recovery and vaccines. I agree with Vera.
Right. Well, Dr. Rosa, when we look at the structural consequences of this pandemic, the outlook for a rebound in trade globally, and certainly the lessons learned, what are your priorities?
Oh, is that Dr. Songwe? Or, oh, okay. Well, I just wanted to talk about just very briefly a few things that haven't been missed. And one, that's the whole issue of gender equality. This cuts across all sectors. The research indicates if we focus successfully and effectively on gender equality across Africa, that could add $316 billion to the GDP up to 2025. So I think in everything we do, the whole gender equality, gender equity issues should be mainstream throughout. Another thing that could be mainstream throughout is expanded trade, expanded intra-African trade, and expanded trade with the world. I didn't talk much about AGOA, but what I should say is that the African Growth and Opportunity Act cost the American tax dollars hardly nothing. And yet in 10 years, we managed to bring in $75 billion in non-oil products from Africa duty-free, quota-free, supporting the creation of millions of jobs across the continent. And so I think we have a good model to show in the kind of trade relationship that should be expanded, and it can be modeled by other countries. And I also believe that globally, we really need to incentivize the private sector. We know that when Western countries and even African governments, when you open up the tax code, the money that's needed will flow. And this should be in the spirit of partnership. And we should really dismantle that antiquated model of paternalism and just kind of Washington, European kind of consensus around what Africa's development model should look like.
All right, thank you, Rosa. And Dr. Vera, when you assess African governments' responses to the pandemic, when we talk about cutting interest rates, providing liquidity assistance, increased social protection spending, and their effectiveness going forward, what do you think are the priorities?
I think three things. The first one, of course, is that governments need to continue where it is possible on the path of reform. And I think reform, as Rosa has said, of the business sector to ensure that we can attract more investment, not just external African investment. There is a lot of African investment that can go around, but we need to attract investments into our economies, into our regions. I think so. That's the first one, is where you can continue on the path to reform, because it will ensure that your growth and your recovery is faster. The second one is infrastructure. We know that infrastructure is a growth multiplier, particularly coming out of a pandemic like this where people have lost jobs. You can create jobs and you can build your economies at the same time. So I think making sure that we have the logistics systems that will underpin a CFTA, even if we do it through digital, it still has to go from port A to port B and from market road X to market road Y before it gets to its destination. So I think we can do a lot more of that, and we can do it better. There is a lot of investment out there. Africa today's rate of return on investment is about 18%. If you buy US Treasury bills, you're buying them at 1%. It's a no-brainer that Africa is clearly an investment destination, hence the need to continue on the path to reform. The third and the most important, I think, is the gender question in its entirety. The gender question in representation, the gender question in ensuring that girls continue and can stay in schools, the gender question in ensuring that we have the right health systems. Yes, we're talking today about vaccines because we have COVID. But when you look at the gamut of maternal and childcare drugs that the continent needs, of which we import most of it and we can produce most of it, I think we do need to start looking at how we can ensure that we protect the health of our girls and our women, more importantly, as we come out of this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vera. And Masuka, when we look at the youth's perspective, we know they're playing a huge part in that push to rethink Africa's economic and government system. So for you, what are the critical areas and priorities that especially you'd love to see open up in order for the youth to better contribute going forward?
Thank you very much. I think my previous speakers already have devised lots of areas that are really priority and need to be pursued. I think one issue that may be very important for youth, we talked about it, the industrial development will be key for Africa. The digitalization, we know that even just putting in place e-government systems would provide so much more opportunity for youth to engage, to facilitate whatever procedures they need to take. And so the digitalization is key, and also putting in place all the infrastructure that is needed so that the opportunities that are surfacing with the 4IR can also be taken by the youth.
All right. Well, I'd like to throw this to our representative from Audu Nepad. On a regional level, we've certainly seen the increasing urgency for Africa to step up its efforts when we talk about a collective response plan, and of course, mobilizing the much needed resources. So what are your thoughts on the priorities in pushing that idea forward? And I mean a collective response plan going forward.
No, thank you. I think this is a very good and timely question. Actually, right now, my presence in Guinea is to support the country to design a program for resource mobilization to support basically the rebound from the COVID. So I think at the regional level, one of the challenges that we have in general is the issue of coordination. You can have like a different programs that may seem consistent and coherent at the national level, but sometimes when you put them together, they seem to be like misaligned and not really contributing all to a good and consistent and coherent program. So I think at the regional level, what is important is to put in place a mechanism for coordination and ensure that that coordination mechanism will help to get the program seen at the regional level to be coherent. For that to happen, I think we need to look at implementation modalities. The first one would be how to domesticate and internalize the program in the national planning systems. The second area is to make sure that you have an alignment between the national capacity and the instrument for evidence-based decision-making. And the third area is how to strengthen the integrated implementation capacity at all levels, both at the national and at the regional level. So I think if we have these three combined with a good coordination mechanism, we can ensure that the program could be coherent in terms of resource design and resource mobilization and the like. Of course, there are now some details or some areas like the one that Dr. Vera Songwe mentioned on how to basically transform certain into liquidity asset and then cut cost on some of the cost of the borrowing that need to be addressed. But all those kind of things could be really tailored if you have like maybe a good coordination mechanism at the regional or at the continental level that ensure that we speak with one voice and we negotiate with one voice. We address the issue of scale and then we reduce the cost of borrowing so that we can mobilize enough resources to rebound. Over to you.
Right. Well, on that note, I do have to close the panel, but I thank you all so much for such an insightful conversation. Certainly what's come out of it is that this pandemic has presented a unique opportunity for Africa going forward. We do have, we've responded with resilience, as Dr. Vera mentioned, and we've also responded with innovation. So going forward, I do think Africa can build back better. And on that note, I'd like to thank all my panelists and thank the Ibrahim Foundation for this opportunity and close the panel and throw right back to you, Zainab.
Thank you so much indeed, Uche, and to all your panelists, and indeed for your patience and perseverance dealing with all the unpredictabilities of the connectivity issues. But this in no way diminished the force of your arguments at all. So for our next event in this year's Ibrahim Governance Weekend, we're going to have our final In Conversation With, and it's going to be Mo in conversation with His Excellency Mahamadou Issoufou, who of course is the winner of the Leadership Prize 2020. And then after that, Mo and I are going to have a little conversation just wrapping up this Governance Weekend, so don't go away.